Washington.
I really wanted to take this question around inequality and who was really taking advantage of digital activism and who wasn't.
Welcome to the Washington Tech Policy Podcast. We deliver the latest tech policy news and brightest tech policy experts to you, wherever you are, so you can stay productive, relevant, and informed in less time. From Washington, D.C., it's the Washington Tech Policy Podcast with Joe Miller.
Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says it's okay for politicians to block Twitter followers. Trump's trade tariffs on China take effect, and Jen Schradie is my guest. Hey everybody, New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says that public officials should be able to block certain Twitter users for harassment. Ocasio-Cortez tweeted that she blocks only a tiny percentage of users, but she also tweeted that users are free to speak their minds even if others find that speech offensive, but that no one should have to require themselves to be subjected to harassing or abusive speech. Interestingly, a federal appeals court found that the president, because he uses Twitter in his official capacity, can't constitutionally block users. The Department of Justice is challenging that decision. The Federal Communications Commission activated disaster reporting for Hurricane Dorian as the hurricane moved up the East Coast over the weekend. The FCC wants communications providers in affected areas to provide updates on outages via the Disaster Information Reporting System, DIRS, D-I-R-S, and you can find that at fcc.gov/NORS, N-O-R-S/disaster. The tariffs that Trump promised to impose on China as part of his trade war against the country went into effect on Sunday. The tariffs will affect some $110 billion worth of Chinese imports across a broad range of goods. Another tranche of tariffs on $160 billion worth of Chinese goods, like laptop computers and other consumer devices, is set to take effect on December 15th. Google publicly announced a hacking attempt that it found and reported to Apple back in February that targeted iPhones. The company said that going to certain websites using your iPhone gave hackers access to your data by installing malware that would run in the background without your knowledge. Hackers were then able to do things like copy your photos or even access encrypted messages via apps like Facebook Messenger and Telegraph. Google Representative Ian Beer advised consumers to continue to be wary of the possibility of being hacked, even on devices with robust security features. Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey's Twitter account was hacked last week. The hackers commenced to tweet racial slurs and other offensive messages until the posts were deleted within the hour, the Hill reports. Twitter says the hackers gained access to the account due to a security oversight by the wireless carrier that exposed Dorsey's phone number. Politico reported Friday that Google will have to pay up to $200 million to settle allegations that YouTube violated the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, which prohibits companies from collecting data from children under 13 without parental consent. Some were disappointed by the news, including Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey, who said the penalty wouldn't be high enough. A group of 90 or so contract workers at Google voted to unionize last week, challenging how the company treats them compared to full-time employees with whom they, in many cases, work side by side. With the help of the United Steelworkers Union, about two-thirds of the data analysts and other white-collar professionals voted to unionize. The petition now heads up to the National Labor Relations Board, which may formally authorize a union vote. Finally, the city of Fort Collins, Colorado is launching its own municipal broadband network, offering up to 1 gig of broadband for $60 a month. Right now, the service targets 20 to 30 households, but the city's looking to ramp up. John Brodkin at Ars Technica reported that the cable industry vigorously opposed the effort, but voters approved the build-out anyway. You can find links to all these stories in the show notes and also in our Twitter feed, and our handle is at WashingTech. Stay with us.
Washington, the inclusive voice of tech policy. Because America won't stand still for the same old insiders. Washington. Moving the needle.
My guest today is Jen Schradie, assistant professor at the Observatoire sociologique de changement at Sciences Po in Paris. Previously, she was a research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at Toulouse. Based at the Toulouse School of Economics, she received her PhD from the Department of Sociology at the University of California-Berkeley with a designated emphasis on new media from the Berkeley Center for New Media. Please welcome Jen Schradie. Jen, thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here, Joe.
So your book, published by Harvard University Press, provides some evidence to counter a lot of what we've been hearing out there about any conservative bias on social media platforms. So I want to get into that, but first tell us about what led you to this work and a bit about the projects you've worked on prior to this that led you to this moment in your career.
It's kind of funny. I've been in the process of moving somewhat and going through old boxes, and what I uncovered were quite a few old political t-shirts from the late 80s and 1990s. And it really got me thinking even more how I came to this point of making and researching and writing this book. And it also got me thinking of how really communication has changed so dramatically with social media. Yes, people sometimes wear political t-shirts, but there tends to be a lot more changing one's profile picture to a certain political cause. And I went to Duke University and stayed in North Carolina and did quite a bit of community and labor organizing, working with a lot of African American and other working class folks who are trying to organize for social justice. And in the process, I really discovered documentary and how that type of communication tool could be a really powerful way for people to try and affect change. But then I started to make films outside of the US, made one particular film, again, about social movements trying to challenge the status quo around justice issues. And as I was touring with this particular film, I spent a lot of time talking to folks, but what really inspired me to ask some of the questions that I'm raising today is when I went to college campuses. And so I really decided to look at this question of why was it that independent filmmakers like myself had to even tell these stories about social movements, folks trying to organize and improve their lives? Why wasn't the mainstream media really covering these issues? And so I went to the Harvard Kennedy School to really look at some of these questions. And it turned out that I went to grad school in 2006. And that time was really a pivotal year, right? So 2006 really was the mass launch of social media. Facebook became available to the general public. Twitter and YouTube really hit the international stage. And so I started to really question this idea of how possibly could digital media really enable disempowered and marginalized folks from getting their message out. So I continued my doctoral studies at UC Berkeley in sociology, really looking at these broader questions. And I thought I'd start by looking at who simply was creating online content, who was blogging, who was creating websites, posting to social media, posting videos, and who was not. And I found quite a dramatic inequality in terms specifically of social class differences. Okay, so we have these social class differences, but what's happening in terms of social movements? Fast forward to 2011, which was also a very pivotal year. That was kind of the height of the so-called Arab Spring, when people were talking about Facebook and Twitter revolutions. It was also a time that Occupy Wall Street was launched. And at that point, the very utopian idea that was being discussed was that now this egalitarian idea of social media was transferred to social and political movements. So I really wanted to take this question around inequality and who was really taking advantage of digital activism and who wasn't.
So turning to your recent book released in the spring entitled The Revolution That Wasn't, How Digital Activism Favors Conservatives, which is available on Amazon. What are you thinking? What are you seeing in terms of the way in which digital platforms have supposedly leveled the playing field between different social and political classes?
Well, Joe, technology hasn't leveled the playing field. So next question. No, actually, no. So that's really, and that was really the promise, right? I mean, I think you're really onto something. That was really the promise of digital activism, that there would be a more pluralist, personalized, participatory, what I like to call the 3 Ps, way of really engaging politically that could overcome some of the barriers to participation that we had before, that people could on their own participate politically using the internet. They could learn more about politics, they could learn about protests or other kind of civic engagement, how to get involved with lobbying, a wide variety of ways that the internet was really promised to be part of this revolution, right? So that was a very utopian time. And when I started my research, I really wanted to interrogate this question that you asked around egalitarianism. And really what I found was that rather than the costs being lower to participate, or rather than people being able to directly engage politically, that there were a number of high costs and barriers really to participation, particularly for people from poor and working class backgrounds. And yes, when I talk about working class, I am using this idea of class as more than income or educational differences, and those are clearly there. In fact, I found that social, political, and labor movement groups that had members from middle to upper classes or people with higher levels of income or education were much more likely to engage online. And that individuals that have what I call assets. So A stands for access, having basic internet access, which may seem super basic to a lot of us, but for a lot of people, having consistent access at home and on the go is not always a reality for people who may have to go to a library or a relative's house to use the internet. And the other part of assets is skills, right? So AS, skills. So really understanding the algorithm of Facebook, for example, knowing that, if I put a picture online, that means more people will be more apt to use it, or to even know, some folks didn't even know you could set up a Facebook group. The other key issue, though, is empowerment, E. So that's the third letter of how I'm spelling assets. And a lot of folks from working class backgrounds just didn't feel empowered to use the internet. They often talked about digital technology as one woman put it, I don't get up there. Or people would say things like, I'm not a tech person. Mm-hmm. That's what other people do. And the other key factor with assets is time, simply having the time, the disposable time. So for those of us who have a mobile phone, a laptop, maybe an iPad or another digital gadget at our disposal at all times, we may be able to participate. But for a lot of folks who don't have this regular access and may need, for example, I talked to one worker who, when he clocked into work, had to check his cell phone for his 12-hour shift. He wasn't allowed to use it even on his breaks, and then he had to drive a long way to and from work. So he had very little time to engage in politics. So all of these factors
or really unionize, for that matter.
Exactly. And that, I think, is the bigger picture, that a lot of the barriers to online engagement are also barriers to general political engagement. The internet has not made these inequalities disappear. And in fact, the point that you make around union organizing is really key, because the other main factor in terms of looking at class, not just as an income or education level, but in terms of class relations, that people who were organizing around a workplace issue often felt a lot of fear in posting something online, they would feel very vulnerable. They felt like it was a very individual process. And again, these were people that I talked to, both white and Black workers in North Carolina, but particularly for the African American folks who would start organizing, getting involved in a union, and would find a rope tied together and dipped in red paint to intimidate them, to make this connection to lynching or the threat of some kind of repercussion for organizing. Just the simple act of posting on Facebook, which may seem simple to us, was not as simple for folks who faced these types of constraints.
I just continue to be amazed that some of these things are still happening in 2019.
Absolutely.
So what are the differences in the forms of activism between the grassroots movements on the left versus those on the right when it comes to how they engage online?
I looked at how and how much different types of social, political, and labor movement groups were really engaging online. So I looked at Facebook activity over a long period, Twitter activity with these groups over the lifetime of their account, if they had one, as well as their website engagement. And what I found by developing a digital activist score, really, to really compare these differences regardless of platform, right? So whether or not Facebook or Twitter disappears, I really wanted to get a sense of how to compare groups from different social classes as well as different political ideologies. So what I did was not only look at these scores, but also how these groups were using these platforms. So certainly conservative groups I found had much higher levels of digital engagement. They simply had higher scores. They were using it more. They were developing these platforms more. They were designing them for participation more, and they had higher levels of engagement. So it wasn't just a question of, if you build it, will they come? It wasn't just this question of building it, but did people really come? And conservatives, because they tended to have a class advantage, and they tended to have more of an organizational structure, they had higher levels of digital engagement. Now, in terms of the question of how they differed, there were some very basic differences. So first of all, conservative groups were much more likely to post articles online than groups on the left. Now, I did this research before people were constantly talking about fake news, but I certainly found through a coding scheme that I did that conservatives were much more likely to post articles that had what I called contentious content, right? It wasn't a typical news story with interviewing both sides, so to speak. They had this more opinionated, contentious content. And in fact, groups that were patriot groups, so even farther to the right, grassroots conservatives, were much more likely to comment and post on these contentious articles, and just in general post more articles. And more memes. Conservatives in my study really were very savvy with using memes, and I saw much less of that with groups on the left. What was more common among groups on the left were pictures of activists at an event, at a rally, maybe holding up a sign or two, but very often standing together in a posed group photo, maybe with their fists up, maybe just smiling. There was much more of that presentation of a collective, right? So groups on the left were much more likely to really focus in general on fairness, both in the topics that they presented, as well as drawing from a diverse group of people and issues. And that diversity helped engage perhaps a broader array of people, but it really ended up with a lower level of digital engagement because a diversity in messaging, a diversity of views, is not as effective online than a very straightforward message of freedom that conservatives tended to focus on, whether it was freedom from the state, free markets, or what they often called freedom of information that they were very passionate about. They tended to have much more succinct messaging. And this difference not only played out in their organizing, but also really manifested online, where whether it was the articles or the type of content that they were putting out, conservatives had a much more focused message, where groups on the left were much more fragmented. And that really made a difference in terms of their digital engagement.
I remember when fake news was something that progressives were concerned about when they were talking about News Corp. And then that was appropriated really by the conservative side. And the same thing happened with some of the other issues that you mentioned. Freedom, for example, the principles of freedom are American principles, but somehow they've managed to co-opt that term as well. So I've just found that interesting.
Yes, and I think that first of all, that when I say that conservatives are focused on freedom and left-leaning progressive groups are focused on fairness, certainly the two issues can cross over, right? Left-leaning groups can be focused on freedom and conservatives can be focused on fairness. But that difference was really key, especially when you talked about this question of fake news. So for conservatives that I interviewed, again, my research was done right before Trump's campaign. And it was interesting because Trump started calling this critique of the mainstream media fake news, but people were talking about this criticism of mainstream journalism so much that they felt like the internet was their savior. I had one activist tell me that Paul Revere had a horse, but we have the internet. When I would talk to conservatives about how they incorporated digital technology into their organizing, their eyes would just light up, right? Their eyes would light up. They really were enamored with how the internet could address the problems that they were seeing around the mainstream media. Whereas when I talk to left-leaning folks, progressive activists, they responded that, yeah, the internet was important and it helped them be more efficient. It was a key part of their organizing, but they weren't as enamored with it. For them, the internet was one of many tools to organize people, right? So for the left, especially the more radical folks, they were more interested in organizing, whereas groups on the right were more interested in what I call informationalizing. And that really made a difference in these digital activism inequalities that I saw in my research.
Well, Jen, it's been awesome having you on the show. So thanks for joining me. And this really gets us toward a more evidence-based approach when it comes to a lot of the misinformation the public's hearing outside of Washington. So thank you. We'll take a quick intermission and we'll break the ice, get your career advice, and hear what you're reading and watching these days. If you had a time machine, would you go back in time or into the future?
Oh, this is such a great question because I am super optimistic despite everything that's happening in the world today. And when I say optimistic, long-term optimistic, I would love to go in the future 100 years from now and see that we have universal health care. I would love to go in the future and see how much amazing organizing the youth have done around climate change and really look at what organizing on the ground can actually do to improve society. Because if we look at the trajectory historically, we have tended to move forward really in a more democratic social justice direction. Certainly there are dips, but I think that the future can only get better.
What's the best piece of career advice you've ever received?
Oh, the best piece of career advice was actually from my parents. I come from a white college-educated background, so for me, career advice is different from folks who are facing many more obstacles. But my parents really told me to do what I wanted to do in life. And my dad's parents were immigrants. My mom's parents, who were farmers in the Midwest, were horrified that she not only moved to California, but, had gone to college. And so for me, that was very important for them to instill this idea of something that I could do what I wanted. And that has really made an impact, I think, in terms of really the building blocks of my work right now. As I said, I was a community labor organizer, I was a documentary filmmaker, and both of those activities really shaped my work right now as a scholar of activism and media. And so that's also a shout out to folks. If you want to change your career, go for it. There's always more time. I had 17 years between my undergraduate and graduate degree.
Wow. Yeah, sometimes it can get to it. I mean, I started this show and this organization when I was pushing 40, and it's just, back then I felt like it was too late, and now I'm saying I just don't, if I hadn't gotten started then. But you hear all these stories about folks who have progressed well beyond the ages that we're conditioned to believe are kind of the outer limit of when we can start a new career. So I highly encourage it. What are you reading and watching these days?
Despite my work with digital technology, I haven't really been able to get into using a Kindle or an e-reader. I love old-fashioned books. And I've been reading a lot of French graphic novels as a way to really improve my French and have that visual help. Definitely way too many academic articles and books, but that's, par for the course and important for me. And there have actually been a variety of academics who've really kind of launched into looking at more of the reality of digital technology right now. There used to be a lot of very utopian ideas of the internet, and I think we've done a really good course correction of having a more realistic view of it. And what I'm watching, so I have been loving The Orville. I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and I love the updated, funny version. So that's been really fun.
Right now, I'm watching Succession on HBO,
okay.
Which is fantastic. It's just, the language in there is just superb, and the characters are complex and obnoxious but lovable at the same time. It's a really great show. But thanks again, Jen.
Check that out.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Jen, for joining me. Do you have any final ideas you'd like to leave with the audience before we close? And where can we find you online?
I think if anyone is really curious about how to get involved politically using the internet, a key piece of advice is that through my research, I found that it takes work, right? So we have this idea that the internet, viral posts just happen out of the blue, right? But really over time, working with other activists, being part of an organization, and really finding people who can really dedicate their time and skills and expertise, whether volunteers or otherwise, that's really key. That digital democracy takes work. It's super easy to find me online. Everything is tied to my last name, Schradie, Schradie. It's a benefit of my grandfather's name being changed at Ellis Island, so no one else has that name. So you can find me at Schradie.com. My Twitter handle is Schradie, so feel free to check out my work.
Jen Schradie, assistant professor at the Observatoire sociologique du changement at the Paris Institute of Political Studies, and the author of The Revolution That Wasn't: How Digital Activism Favors Conservatives, Harvard University Press. Jen, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, Joe.
That concludes episode 199 of the podcast. Thanks so much for listening. If you like what we do, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment, head over to Apple Podcasts, give it a review. It helps others know what they can expect from the show and really helps us out. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you back here next week. Take care.
Washington Tech.